Alright, and welcome to Solving Quadratics Review. Now, in our very first example, we have negative 20 equals negative 2 parentheses x plus 4 squared minus 2. And our very first question that we want to ask ourselves is, what type of method should we use? And you can look over here to the right where I see the 1, 2, and the 3. If this is in vertex form, we want to solve it. If it's in standard form, we first want to try to factor it. If we can't do that and it's in standard form, then we want to use the quadratic formula. We'll notice that this is in the form of, let's say f of x is equal to a parentheses x minus h squared plus k. Alright, even though some of the signs might be different, you can see it still holds the same form. And if you will recall, that is vertex form. So in this particular instance, we know that we want to try and solve this. Okay, so what would be the very first thing that we're going to do if we are in fact going to solve this? Well, this means that we're going to be using our PEMDAS formula in reverse. So let's see, here's PEMDAS. And what things do I note? Well, over here on the right hand side, I note that there is subtraction. So I'll put a little star by the S. I will note that there is a square, so there's an exponent. I see two things are side by side, so I can note multiplication. And lastly, even though it might look like addition, I do see a parentheses. Alright, and remember, when solving, we're actually doing these in reverse. So we start at the very bottom, and the first thing that we want to get rid of is the subtraction. And you get rid of these operations by doing the opposite. So what is the opposite of subtraction? Well, we're going to add 2 to both the left and the right. And what do we get here? Negative 20 plus 2 will go ahead and give us negative 18. So we'll say negative 18 is equal to negative 2 parentheses x plus 4 squared. And of course that zeroes out. Now from here, let's use a different color. Let's use this nice red. We're working our way up, and the next thing we want to get up to is the multiplication. Remember, we get rid of multiplication by doing the opposite. We're going to divide. So we'll divide both sides by negative 2. Now that cancels out. And a negative divided by negative is a positive. 18 divided by 2 is 9. Okay, so now we have 9 is equal to the parentheses x plus 4 squared. Now as I continue to move up, let's switch to white, we'll see that the next thing to get rid of is our exponent. Now for this one, you look at it, you say, okay, well the exponent is a square. What's the opposite of a square? Well, we should know that that is a square root. And what I do to the right, I have to do to the left. Now, what is the square root of 9? We know that the square of 9 is plus or minus 3. You should have that one memorized at this point, hopefully. And don't forget, when you take the square root of something, you have to use a plus or minus. And here we have x plus 4. Now, from here, we can really do two things. I guess we'll do it this way. We'll go ahead and say, using this nice kind of purple color, I'm going to subtract 4, and I'm going to subtract 4. Now let's move everything over here to the right. And we can kind of write it like this. We can say, okay, we have write minus 4 plus or minus 3 is equal to x. And that actually has two separate solutions. It has negative 4 plus 3 is equal to x, comma, it also has negative 4 minus 3 is equal to x. And we'll note that negative 4 plus 3 is negative 1 is equal to x, and negative 4 minus 3 is negative 7 is equal to x, and therefore we have our two solutions. X is equal to negative 7, comma, negative 1. Remember, do not put those in parentheses. We're just listing out a set of solutions. All right, let's move on to our second type of quadratic solving. Okay, let's take a look at example 2. Now we'll notice that example 2 is almost written backwards, but it's not written in vertex form. We can clearly see that example 2 is written in standard form, which is ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to f of x. And remember, in this case, it's already set to 0, but if it's not, we always have to set to 0. And if you need to know why that is, well, remember, whenever you think about where is that quadratic function or that parabola crossing the x-axis, it crosses where y is equal to 0, or another way to say that is where f of x is equal to 0. Now from here, we want to use factoring. And remember, we have three types of factoring. We have simple factoring, we have factoring out the GCF, and we have factoring by grouping. So whenever the value in front of x squared is anything other than a 1, in this case it's a 2, we can't use simple factoring. Also, 2, 7, and negative 4 can't all be divided by 2, so we can't factor out a as the GCF, which means that we'll have to use factoring by grouping. Okay, so what were our steps for factoring by grouping? Well, remember, step 1, we're going to multiply a times c, so in this case 2 times negative 4, which will be negative 8. Okay, step 2, we want to find two numbers. Let's call this b sub 1 plus b sub 2, which are equal to negative 8, but they add up to be our b term. Okay, so essentially, more or less, what does that really mean? It means that we're going to take this 2x squared and this minus 4 equals 0. We're going to leave all that alone, but what we're really trying to do here is we're trying to take this positive 7x and split it up into two numbers that equal our a times c, or our negative 8. Okay, so let's just kind of break this down. What two numbers multiply to be negative 8 but add up to be positive 7? So the way I would do this is I would always list out the factors of 8. I know the factors of 8 are 1 and 8, and 2 and 4. And notice our 7 is positive, so that means that the larger number would have to be positive in either case. And since the a times c term is negative, we need to have a negative times a positive. Okay, so negative 1 times 8 would be negative 8, and negative 1 plus 8 is going to be positive 7. Negative 2 times 4 is negative 8, and negative 2 plus 4 is equal to positive 2. And we'll notice we were looking all along for the negative 1 and the 8 because those actually add up to be our middle term, our b term. And now the appropriate question is which one goes with which. And we have 1 and 8 and 2 and 4. In this case, it really won't matter. So let's just write negative 1x plus 8x, and we can now move forward. So what do we do here? We're going to use factoring by grouping. We'll put those first two terms in one group, and we'll put the second two terms in another group. And let's go through with this very first one, and let's see what we can factor out. Well, I see there's a 2 coefficient, and it's positive. Since it's positive, we know we'll divide by a positive number. And 2 and 1 have no factors in common that we can pull out. So the only thing we can pull out here, there's 2 x's right there, there's 1 x right there. We can simply pull out an x from each one of those. Alright, so this x gets pulled out to the front, and the leftovers stay inside. 2x divided by x is simply, 2x squared divided by x is simply 2x, and negative 1x divided by x is negative 1. Now right here, we see our leading term that plus 8 is a positive, so we'll divide everything by a positive. And what number can we divide both 8 and 4 by? Well, 4. We can divide both of those by 4. And since this one does not have an x, we can't pull out an x. We'll just write plus 4, parentheses, and 8 divided by 4, or 8x divided by 4 will give us 2x, and negative 4 plus 1, or negative 4 divided by positive 4, will give us a negative 1. Alright? And of course, remember this is always being set equal to 0. At this point, we now want to go ahead and divide out our factors that we have in common. In this case, you can see that both of these terms share a 2x minus 1. And so when we factor that out to the front, we have 2x minus 1 times essentially the leftovers. That crosses out, and you can see our leftovers are x plus 4 are equal to 0. Now remember, whenever you do this, we have both of these factors have to be set equal to 0. And so we can say in this first case, we can go ahead and write 2x minus 1 is equal to 0. And in our second case, x plus 4 is equal to 0. And here on the left, this should be fairly simple for all of y'all now. we will add 1 to both sides. Now I have 2x is equal to 1. I divide both sides by 2, and we get x is equal to 1/2. And I'll write that more clearly over here. X is equal to 1/2, comma. And right here in the blue, we know that to get rid of this plus 4, we will subtract 4 from both sides, and we'll get x is equal to -4. All right? And that's how you solve our second example with factoring by grouping. Let's move on to our third and final example. Okay, here we have example 3, and you'll notice a couple things. Thing number 1 you'll notice is that f of x is not set equal to 0. All right? Or this quadratic in general is not set equal to 0. So what should we do? Well, I'd always encourage you, if there's a single term on one side, to simply move that. To get rid of a positive 2, I will subtract 2 from both sides, and we now have this. We now have 3x squared minus 5x, and positive 1 minus 2 will of course give us -1. We'll say that that is equal to 0. Okay, now from here, I could try factoring by grouping, but let's go ahead and use our other method. Let's go ahead and say, okay, you know what, we're going to label this our A term. Say we're going to go ahead and label this our B term, and we're going to go ahead and label that our C term. And notice our formula, our quadratic formula, is x is equal to -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And one mistake that I see some of y'all making is not putting that -b on top of the fraction bar. So make sure you use that fraction bar under the whole thing. Okay, so now let's go ahead and plug in all of our terms. And remember, I would always encourage you to use parentheses for each and every letter. Okay, and so let's plug in all the things we know by their color. I use B in red, and that's -5. So everywhere I see a B, I'm going to plug in -5. For my A term, I use orange, and I see an A term right there and an A term right there, and our A term is 3 and 3. And lastly, for my C term, I use white, and our C term will be -1. Now from here, you're going to have to pause the video as you go, but I'm going to simply clean this up every time I hit the bottom of the page. So when I hit the bottom of the page, make sure you pause the video so you can finish taking your notes. Okay, so I've cleaned this up a little bit, and now we have a lot of room to work. So how should we tackle this problem? Well, the first thing I would always have y'all do is go ahead and tackle the outside. So here on the outside, we see we have two negatives, or a negative times a negative, which will be a +5 plus or minus the square root of. And the next thing I would ask you to do is tackle the inside of the square root, where here we have a -5 squared. So let's see, -5 squared will be +25. Alright, from here I would ask you to take your 3 terms, the -4ac, and I would always ask you to count up your number of negatives. Here I see we have 2 negatives, and 2 negatives make a positive. Now if you're going to use this method of counting up the negatives, change them to plus signs. From there, we have 4 times 3, which is 12, and 12 times 1, which is just 12. And of course, this all goes over, and now we're going to go ahead and simplify the bottom. And after we simplify the bottom, 2 times 3, we'll get 6. Now from here, it should be quite obvious. The very next thing we'll do is we will simplify the inside of this square root. So we have plus or minus the square root of 25 plus 12, which is 37, all over 6. And here, this is actually the most reduced form if we don't want to go through decimals. And so I think we're just going to leave this right here as this most reduced form. Alright? I hope this helps, and I'll see you all in our next video.